At 700 hours on January 24, 1945, First Lieutenant Garland Merl Connor pressed the field telephone receiver against his ear inside the 3rd Battalion command post, his breath forming ice crystals in the sub-zero air as German 88mm shells tore apart the frozen forest 400 yards to his front. 25 years old, intelligence officer, a man whose job was to study maps and interrogate prisoners, not to die in the snow. He had been released from the field hospital 48 hours earlier. The shrapnel wounds in his legs and back had not fully healed. He could feel them pulling with every movement. The German 19th Army had committed 600 infantry and 6 Mark VI Tiger tanks to a single objective: smash through the American lines near Husson, France, and turn the Colmar pocket into a killing field. Connor stood 5 feet 6 inches tall. It weighed 120 pounds, soaking wet. A tobacco farmer from Clinton County, Kentucky, who had never seen the inside of a high school classroom. The nearest school had been 15 miles from his family's farm on dirt roads that disappeared in winter. He had walked behind mules for most of his childhood. Now he stood behind a wall of sandbags, watching 60-ton steel fortresses roll toward his battalion. 4 years of war, 10 major campaigns, 4 amphibious assault landings where he had waded through surf under machine gun fire. Wounded 7 times. The last wound had come 3 weeks ago when a mortar fragment had torn through his shoulder blade. The doctors had told him he needed 6 weeks of recovery. He had given them 6 days before returning to 3rd Battalion. The battalion held a sector of the front line on the northern edge of the Colmar pocket. The pocket was the last German-held territory in France, 850 square miles of frozen forest and farmland west of the Rhine River. The Germans had clung to it since November 1944. Every attempt to eliminate the pocket had failed. The French First Army had lost thousands trying to push the Wehrmacht back across the Rhine. Bodies frozen in the snow. Artillery craters filled with ice. Operation Nordwind had begun on New Year's Day, Hitler's last major offensive in the West. While the Battle of the Bulge still consumed American forces 300 miles north, Army Group G had been ordered to break through Allied lines in Alsace and relieve the pocket. The offensive had stalled, but the Germans inside the pocket remained, and they were desperate. Desperate men with nothing to lose fought harder than fresh troops with everything to gain. 3rd Battalion had been on the line for 18 consecutive days. Temperatures averaged 10 degrees below zero. No moonlight to see by. Snow covered the foxholes, the equipment, the bodies of men who had frozen to death at their posts. Soldiers slept in holes carved into frozen earth when they could sleep at all. German patrols tested the American wire every night, probing for weakness, looking for gaps. The battalion had lost 43 men in 2 weeks, most to artillery fire and snipers, some to the cold itself. Connor worked as the battalion intelligence officer. His job was to gather information about enemy movements, interrogate captured soldiers, analyze patrol reports, and mark German positions on acetate-covered maps. It was not a combat role. Intelligence officers worked behind the lines. They studied, they reported, they briefed. They did not lead assaults. They did not charge machine gun nests. But Connor had not stayed behind the lines during 4 years of combat. He wore 4 silver stars on his chest. Each one represented a moment when he had stepped forward into direct fire to save other soldiers. October 1943 in Italy, January 1944 at Anzio, September 1944 in France, February 1945. 4 times he had been recommended for higher awards. 4 times the paperwork had been downgraded or lost. He had a reputation in 3rd Battalion. When the situation turned desperate, when officers started looking at each other wondering who would act first, Connor moved forward. At 07:15, the German artillery barrage intensified. His shells walked methodically across the battalion's forward positions like a man walking through a garden crushing flowers. Trees exploded into splinters. Frozen earth fountained into the air and came down as hard black rain. The barrage lasted exactly 12 minutes. Then it stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that means something worse is coming. Then the sound of engines. Deep, mechanical. The unmistakable rumble of heavy armor on frozen ground. A runner burst through the command post entrance, snow flying from his boots, his face white with fear. Germans advancing, 6 Tigers, infantry behind them in assault formation, hundreds of German soldiers moving through the shattered forest toward the battalion's left flank. Moving fast, the battalion commander stared at the map. If the Tigers reached the American foxholes, they would roll through the positions like a harvester through wheat. The battalion would be overrun in minutes. There were no American tanks positioned to stop them. No tank destroyers within 5 miles. No air support in weather like this. The only weapon capable of stopping 6 Mark 6 Tigers was artillery. Concentrated fire from 105mm howitzers. But artillery was blind without forward observers. Someone had to see the German advance. Someone had to watch the shells land and adjust the fire. Walk the explosions toward the enemy. Correct for wind and temperature and the rotation of the earth itself. The forward observation post had been destroyed in the first minutes of the barrage. The observers were dead or wounded or scattered. No one could see the German advance from the command post. The trees blocked the view, and the terrain was wrong. To see the Germans, someone would have to go forward, into the open, into the kill zone. Connor looked at the map. Then he looked at the telephone wire spooled against the wall. If you want to see more of stories like this, please hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us share more forgotten stories from World War II. Connor grabbed the telephone handset, and 400 yards of field wire coiled against the command post wall. The battalion commander started to say something, then stopped. There was nothing to say. They both knew what had to happen. Someone had to become the eyes of the artillery. Someone had to go forward into the killing ground and direct fire onto an enemy they could barely see through the smoke and snow. Connor stepped through the sandbagged entrance into the frozen morning. The temperature was 8 degrees below zero, the kind of cold that turned moisture in your lungs to ice crystals, the kind of cold that made rifle bolts stick and turned human fingers into useless clubs of frozen meat within minutes. The field between the command post and the forward American positions stretched 400 yards across open ground. No cover, no defilade. Just snow-covered earth and the skeletal remains of what had once been a wheat field. German artillery observers had ranged every inch of that ground weeks ago. They knew the exact coordinates. They had fired registration rounds and marked their maps. Any movement in that field would draw fire within seconds. Connor started running. He moved in a crouch, playing out the telephone wire behind him like a sailor paying out line. His boots broke through the frozen crust of snow with each step, plunging into softer powder beneath. The wire snagged on debris. He yanked it free without slowing. His breath came in ragged gasps that turned to fog and froze on the wool scarf wrapped around his face. The wounds in his back and legs pulled with every stride. Fresh blood soaked through the bandages beneath his uniform. And the first German shell landed 50 yards to his left. The concussion wave hit him like a physical wall. Dirt and snow and frozen earth fragments peppered his right side. He kept running. Artillery observers worked in patterns. They had seen him. Now they were adjusting, walking the fire toward him. The next shell would be closer. 20 seconds later it came, 30 yards to his right. Close enough that the heat flash burned his face even through the freezing air. Close enough that the overpressure made his ears ring and turned the world into a muffled underwater nightmare. He could see the dark shapes of American soldiers in their foxholes ahead. 75 yards, 50. The third shell landed directly behind him. The blast lifted him off his feet and threw him forward. He hit the snow rolling, somehow keeping his grip on the telephone handset. The wire went taut. For a horrible moment, he thought it had snapped. Then it went slack again. Still connected. Still linked to the fire direction center and the 12 105mm howitzers positioned 3 miles behind the lines. Connor scrambled to his feet and kept moving. His ears were bleeding. He could feel the warm trickle running down his neck. The high-pitched ringing in his head was so loud he couldn't hear the next shell coming. It landed where he had been lying 3 seconds earlier. He crossed the American forward positions at a dead sprint and kept going. Soldiers shouted at him from their foxholes, asking what he was doing, asking if he had lost his mind. He ignored them. 30 yards beyond the American line, he found what he was looking for: a drainage ditch. Probably cut by spring runoff when this had been farmland and farmers had cared about irrigation. 18 inches deep, maybe 2 feet wide. It ran perpendicular to the German advance for about 40 yards before petering out into nothing. It was the shallowest, most pathetic excuse for cover Connor had ever seen. It would not stop a rifle bullet. It would not stop shrapnel. It would barely stop a strong wind. He threw himself into it. The frozen mud bottom hit him like concrete. He pressed himself flat, gasping for air. The telephone handset clutched against his chest. Behind him, 30 yards back, the American soldiers watched from their foxholes. Ahead of him, somewhere in the smoke and snow and shattered forest, 600 German infantry and 6 Tiger tanks advanced toward positions they intended to overrun. Connor was now the only thing between the German army and his battalion. A 120-pound intelligence officer lying in an 18-inch ditch with nothing but a telephone and the ability to call down fire from guns he could not see onto an enemy that was trying very hard to kill him. He pressed the handset to his ear. Fire Direction Center. This is Observer Connor. I have eyes on. Requesting fire mission. The voice on the other end crackled with static and relief. Confirmed, Observer Connor. All guns standing by. Send coordinates. Connor raised his head just enough to see over the lip of the ditch. The German infantry were still 800 yards out, moving in dispersed formation through the trees. Professional soldiers who knew how to advance under fire. Behind them, deeper in the forest, he could hear the Tigers and the grinding mechanical scream of 700 horsepower Maybach engines pushing 60 tons of armor through frozen ground. He gave the coordinates, listened to the fire direction officer repeat them back. Then he waited. Artillery fire moved at the speed of physics. The howitzers were 3 miles back. The shells would arc up into the gray sky and come down at a steep angle. Time of flight, 40 seconds. Connor counted in his head. At 38 seconds, he heard the whistle, high-pitched, growing louder. The first salvo of 12 105mm high-explosive shells came down in a ragged line 200 yards beyond the advancing Germans. Too far. Connor keyed the handset. Drop 100, fire for effect. Drop 100, fire for effect. The disembodied voice repeated his order. Somewhere 3 miles away, 12 gun crews were cranking elevation wheels and loading fresh shells. The mathematics of death performed with slide rules and firing tables and the accumulated experience of men who had been doing this for years. 40 seconds later, the second salvo landed. This time, the shells came down 100 yards closer, right in the middle of the German formation. Trees exploded into splinters. Earth fountained into the air. Connor watched German soldiers throw themselves flat or scramble for cover behind whatever they could find. Some of them didn't get up, but the advance didn't stop. The Germans had been through this before. They knew American artillery patterns. They knew the shells came in salvos with gaps between. They knew if they kept moving, kept pressure on the American line, eventually they would get close enough that the Americans couldn't fire without hitting their own positions. Connor adjusted fire, walking the shells back and forth across the German line, bracketing them, trying to break their momentum. The howitzers fired continuously, 12 guns pumping out shells as fast as the crews could load them. The ground trembled with the impacts. Smoke and snow and pulverized earth filled the air until visibility dropped to almost nothing. Then the Tigers broke cover. 6 of them emerged from the tree line like prehistoric monsters stepping out of a cave. Mark 6 Tigers, the most feared tank in the German arsenal. Each one weighed 60 tons, carried an 88mm main gun that could punch through the armor of any American tank at 2,000 yards, frontal armor 8 inches thick. And no American weapon in the battalion could penetrate it. Not the bazookas, not the anti-tank rifles, not even a direct hit from a 105mm shell at this range. The Tigers spread out into a wedge formation and began rolling toward the American positions. They moved slowly, deliberately, crushing small trees beneath their tracks. The earth shook with each revolution of their massive drive wheels. Behind them, the German infantry followed in the tank's wake, using the armored monsters as mobile cover. Connor pressed himself flat in the ditch and keyed the handset. Fire direction, be advised. 6 heavy tanks entering the kill zone, request armor-piercing rounds. Static. Then, Observer Connor, we don't have armor-piercing, only high explosive and smoke. Connor watched the Tigers advance. 400 yards out now. Moving at perhaps 10 miles per hour through the snow. The math was simple. At that speed, they would reach the American foxholes in less than 4 minutes. Once they crossed the line, it was over. The Tigers would roll through the positions, their machine guns and main guns firing point-blank into foxholes. The German infantry would mop up anyone who survived. 350 yards. Connor could see the German tank commanders now, standing upright in their cupolas, scanning for targets. The lead Tiger's main gun traversed left, then right, looking for something worth an 88mm shell. The American positions were dug in well enough that the Germans couldn't see them yet, but they would. In less than a minute, they would be close enough to spot the foxholes and the machine gun nests and the command post. 300 yards. Connor made a decision that most men couldn't make, the kind of decision that separates soldiers who survive from soldiers who save others at the cost of their own lives. He keyed the handset. Fire direction center. Adjust fire. New target coordinates. Send it. Connor gave them his own position, the coordinates of the ditch he was lying in. The fire direction officer paused. Observer Connor, confirm coordinates. Those readings put the impact zone at your location. Confirmed. Fire on my position. Create a wall of steel 30 yards forward of the American line. I will adjust from impact. Another pause. Longer this time. The fire direction officer understood what Connor was asking. He was asking them to drop 105mm high explosive shells danger close, so close that the blast radius would extend over Connor's position. So close that the margin of error was 0, 250 yards. The Tigers were close enough now that Connor could see the individual track links, could see the snow packed into the road wheels, could see the stenciled numbers on their turrets. He could hear the squeal of the drive trains and the roar of the engines. Behind them, the German infantry moved in a loose skirmish line. 600 men, maybe more. Hard to count through the smoke. 200 yards. Fire mission confirmed, the voice crackled. All guns firing for effect on your coordinates. Time of flight, 40 seconds. Danger close. Recommend you take cover. Connor pressed himself into the bottom of the 18-inch ditch. There was nowhere else to go, no deeper hole to hide in, no bunker to retreat to. Now he was 30 yards ahead of his own lines and 200 yards in front of 6 Tiger tanks. When the shells came down, they would land close enough to tear him apart. 150 yards. He could see the faces of the German tank commanders now. Young men, probably younger than him, doing their jobs, following orders, trying to win a war that was already lost, but nobody had told them yet. The lead Tiger's machine gun opened fire. Tracers arced toward the American positions. Bullets kicked up snow along the lip of the foxholes. 100 yards. Connor counted seconds in his head. 35, 36, 37. At 38 seconds, he heard the whistle. Different this time. Closer, louder, growing from a distant shriek to a freight train roar in the span of a heartbeat. The first salvo of 12 105mm shells came down in a line 40 yards in front of him. The world turned into fire and noise and pressure. The concussion waves hammered into the ditch like invisible fists. Connor's body slammed against the frozen earth. His lungs emptied. His vision went white. The telephone handset flew from his hand. He grabbed for it blindly, his fingers numb and clumsy, and somehow caught the cord before it jerked away. The shells kept falling. The howitzers had been loaded with continuous fire orders. 12 guns firing as fast as human hands could ram shells into breaches. The barrage walked back and forth across a 100-yard front like a scythe cutting wheat. The noise was beyond anything describable. Beyond thunder, beyond artillery. It was the sound of the earth itself being torn apart. Connor pulled the handset back to his ear. He couldn't hear anything. His eardrums were bleeding, but he could shout coordinates and trust that someone 3 miles away could hear them. Drop 50, and maintain fire." The next salvo landed closer, close enough that shrapnel hummed over his head like angry hornets, close enough that he could feel the heat flash through the frozen air, close enough that chunks of frozen earth rained down into the ditch and buried him to the waist. He raised his head 6 inches and looked forward through the wall of smoke and fire. The Tigers had stopped. All 6 of them, dead in their tracks, not destroyed. The shells couldn't penetrate their armor, but blinded. The explosions had damaged their vision blocks and optics, torn off external equipment, cracked periscopes. The tank commanders had dropped down into their cupolas and buttoned up. Now the Tigers sat motionless in the kill zone, 70 tons of steel rendered impotent by a 120-pound man with a telephone. The German infantry had gone to ground, taking cover wherever they could find it, behind the tanks, in shell craters, behind the remnants of trees. They were pinned, unable to advance through the curtain of explosives, unable to retreat without exposing themselves to fire. Connor kept the barrage falling for 3 hours. Connor switched tactics. He called for smoke rounds mixed with high explosives. The smoke shells burst across the kill zone, releasing thick white phosphorus clouds that clung to the frozen ground and reduced visibility to 0. The Tigers were already blind from damaged optics. And now they were operating in a white fog that turned the battlefield into a featureless void. The high explosive rounds continued to fall in a precise pattern. Connor walked them methodically across the German formation, not trying to penetrate the Tigers' armor anymore. That was impossible. Instead, he targeted their tracks, the vulnerable running gear, the road wheels and drive sprockets and return rollers that kept 60 tons of steel mobile. A direct hit on a track wouldn't destroy a Tiger, but it would cripple one. Turn a mobile fortress into a stationary pillbox, and a stationary tank in the middle of an artillery barrage was a coffin waiting to be sealed. The barrage continued, shells landing every 40 seconds with mechanical precision. The ground shook continuously, and the air filled with the smell of cordite and burning metal and churned earth. Connor adjusted fire by sound as much as sight, listening for the secondary explosions that meant a shell had hit something solid, watching for movement through the smoke. One of the Tigers tried to retreat. Connor saw it through a gap in the smoke, the massive tank attempting to reverse out of the kill zone. Its damaged optics made the maneuver clumsy. The driver couldn't see clearly. The tank angled sideways, exposing its thinner side armor to the American positions. Connor keyed the handset. Shift fire right 50. Single tank reversing. Concentrate fire. 3 salvos landed around the retreating Tiger in rapid succession. The third salvo scored a direct hit on the left track assembly. But the track separated from the drive sprocket in a shower of sparks and broken metal. The Tiger lurched to a stop, immobilized. The crew would survive, The armor was too thick for 105mm shells to penetrate, but the tank was finished as a fighting vehicle. It sat motionless in the snow, a 60-ton monument to the power of coordinated artillery fire. Connor had been lying in the ditch for an hour when he realized he wasn't alone. A private had crawled forward from the American lines. Young kid, maybe 19 years old. He slithered into the ditch next to Connor, carrying an ammunition can full of fresh telephone wire and 3 canteens of water. His face was white with fear, but his hands were steady. "Sir, battalion commander sent me. I figured you might need backup." Connor took one of the canteens and drank without taking his eyes off the kill zone. The water was frozen. He had to crack the ice with his teeth and suck out the liquid beneath. "What's your name?" "Private Jensen, sir." "You know what you just crawled into, Jensen?" "Yes, sir. Same thing you're in." Connor almost smiled. "Stay low. Watch the left flank. Germans try to maneuver around the smoke, you tell me." They lay side by side in the 18-inch ditch, Connor directing fire, Jensen watching for movement and feeding fresh wire when the old wire became damaged by shrapnel. The barrage continued without pause. Somewhere behind them, 3 miles back, the artillery crews were working like machines. Loading, firing, loading, firing. The howitzer barrels would be glowing red from the sustained fire, and the crews would be exhausted. But they kept firing. 2 hours in, Connor noticed the German infantry attempting to infiltrate. Small groups of 3 or 4 soldiers crawling through the smoke toward the American positions, using shell craters for cover, moving during the gaps between salvos when the noise died down enough to navigate. He adjusted fire again, shifting the barrage pattern to catch the infiltrators in the open, but some of them got through. He could see them now. Ghostly figures moving through the white phosphorus fog. 50 yards out. 40. Jensen saw them too. "Sir, they're getting close. I see them." 30 yards. The Germans were crawling on their bellies through the snow, moving slowly to avoid drawing attention. Connor called in another adjustment, and the shells landed close enough that he could feel the heat on his face. Close enough that dirt rained down into the ditch. 20 yards. Connor could hear them now, the crunch of snow under their bodies, the metallic click of rifle bolts being eased forward. They were trying to flank the American positions by going around the barrage, using the ditch as a landmark to navigate by. 15 yards. A shell landed short. The explosion was close enough that the blast wave crushed Connor's chest and made his vision go black at the edges. He gasped for air that wouldn't come. His lungs wouldn't work. For a horrible moment, he thought he was dying. Then his diaphragm started working again, and he sucked in a ragged breath that tasted like smoke and blood. Jensen screamed. Connor turned his head. The private was clutching his right shoulder. Blood poured between his fingers. Shrapnel from the same shell that had nearly killed Connor. A jagged piece of steel casing had torn through Jensen's uniform and buried itself in the muscle above his collarbone. "Go back," Connor said. "Get to the aid station." Jensen shook his head. Blood ran down his arm and dripped onto the snow. "No, sir, not leaving." "That's an order, Private." "With respect, sir, you need someone watching your back. Those Germans are 10 yards out." Connor looked forward. Jensen was right. He could see them clearly now through the thinning smoke. German soldiers in winter camouflage, 4 of them, maybe 5. Close enough that he could see the frost on their rifle barrels. They hadn't spotted the ditch yet, but they would. He keyed the handset. His voice was hoarse from shouting over the artillery. "The fire direction, drop 25. Danger close, fire for effect." Jensen pressed himself flat beside Connor. His face was gray from blood loss, but his eyes were alert. The shells came down so close that Connor felt the heat flash burn through his wool uniform. So close that the concussion waves lifted both men 6 inches off the ground and slammed them back down. The German infiltrators disappeared, erased by high explosives. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but churned earth and fragments of equipment. Connor and Jensen lay in the ditch, both of them bleeding, both of them deaf from the continuous barrage, both of them somehow still alive while men died all around them. 3 hours after Connor had first dropped into the ditch, the fire direction officer's voice crackled over the handset. Observer Connor, the ammunition status critical. Estimate 10 minutes of fire remaining. Request final target. The Tigers had withdrawn. 4 of them still mobile, 2 crippled and abandoned by their crews. The German infantry had pulled back into the forest, retreating toward their original positions. The attack had failed. The American line had held. Connor raised his head and looked across the killing ground. He could see the Germans withdrawing through the trees, moving in good order. Combat veterans who knew when to break contact. They would regroup, reorganize, try again tomorrow or the next day. He gave coordinates for the retreat path. Fire for effect, pursue. The final salvos chased the Germans back into the forest. Shells landing among the trees, bursting overhead in air bursts that sent shrapnel raining down on anyone caught in the open. Then making the Germans pay for every yard of their withdrawal. Then the guns fell silent. The sudden absence of noise was worse than the barrage. Connor's ears rang so loudly, he thought he could hear the sound of his own blood moving through his veins. He lay in the ditch, the telephone handset still pressed to his ear, listening to static. Observer Connor, fire mission complete. All guns ceased fire. Return to friendly lines. Connor tried to move. His legs wouldn't work. He had been lying in the same position for 3 hours in sub-zero temperatures. His muscles had locked up. His feet were numb. He couldn't feel his hands. Jensen grabbed him under the arms and pulled. Together they crawled backward out of the ditch toward the American foxholes. 30 yards that felt like 3 miles. Soldiers reached out to haul them the final distance. Someone wrapped a blanket around Connor's shoulders. Someone else pressed a canteen of hot coffee into his frozen hands. The battalion commander appeared, looking down at Connor with an expression that was equal parts relief and disbelief. Jesus Christ, Connor, you just stopped 6 Tigers and 600 infantry with a telephone. Connor didn't respond. He was staring at his hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. Not from fear, from exhaustion and cold, and the after effects of 3 hours of continuous concussion waves slamming into his body. They carried him back to the aid station. The medics cut off his uniform and found fresh wounds he hadn't noticed, shrapnel in his back and legs and arms. Minor compared to what he had survived, but enough to earn another Purple Heart. His 8th. The paperwork was filed. If the after-action reports were written, Connor's commanding officer recommended him for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation was downgraded to a Distinguished Service Cross. Then it was filed away in a cardboard box and forgotten. Connor came home in November 1945. He stepped off a train in Clinton County, Kentucky, wearing his uniform and carrying a duffel bag that contained everything he owned. His family met him at the station. His mother cried. His father shook his hand without saying much. They drove him home in a truck with a broken muffler that backfired like rifle shots every time they hit a bump. The farm was exactly as he had left it. 40 acres of tobacco and corn, a house that needed paint, fences that needed mending, mules that needed feeding. He changed out of his uniform that same afternoon and never put it on again. And he worked the land, walked behind the same mules he had walked behind as a child, planted tobacco in the spring, harvested it in the fall, fixed tractors when they broke, helped neighbors when they needed it. He was quiet, had always been quiet. The war made him more so. He met Pauline at a church social in 1947. She was a teacher from the next county over. They courted for 6 months and married in a small ceremony with family and a few friends. He never told her about the war, never mentioned the medals, never talked about France or Italy or Anzio or the ditch outside Husan. Pauline found the medals by accident 20 years later. She was cleaning out a closet and discovered a duffel bag pushed into the back corner behind winter coats and old boots. Inside were the Distinguished Service Cross and 4 silver stars and 8 purple hearts, all jumbled together with their ribbons tangled. She brought them to Connor that evening. "Why didn't you tell me about these?" He glanced at them from his chair by the fireplace, shrugged. Didn't seem important. "You earned these. You should be proud. Talking about it feels like bragging." She tried several times over the years to get him to apply for additional recognition. She had heard stories from other veterans, knew that Connor's actions deserved more than what he had received, but he refused every time. Said what he had done was just his job. Said other men had done more and received less. Said the medals in the box were more than enough. He died in 1998, 78 years old. Heart failure. And he was buried in the county cemetery with a simple headstone that listed his name and dates and branch of service. No mention of medals, no mention of heroism, just another veteran among thousands. Pauline refused to let it end there. She contacted the Army, filed formal requests for Connor's service records, discovered that the original Medal of Honor recommendation had been downgraded and buried in archives. She hired researchers, tracked down surviving members of 3rd Battalion, found witnesses who had watched Connor sprint across that frozen field, found the radio operator who had received Connor's fire missions, found Private Jensen, who still carried shrapnel in his shoulder from that day in the ditch. The Army said no. Time limits had expired. Regulations prohibited posthumous upgrades after more than 3 years, and the case was closed. Pauline hired lawyers, filed appeals, contacted congressmen, wrote letters to anyone who would listen. She was 80 years old and fighting the same bureaucracy that had forgotten her husband's heroism for half a century. In 2014, a government attorney named Sarah Mitchell was assigned to defend the Army's position. She reviewed Connor's file as part of her preparation, read the after-action reports, saw the witness statements, understood the magnitude of what Connor had done. During a pre-hearing conference, she asked about the 3rd Battalion roster, cross-referenced it against her own family records. Her father had served in 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment. He had been in one of those foxholes 30 yards behind Connor's ditch. Sarah Mitchell began to cry in the middle of the conference room. She realized her father owed his life to the man she was technically opposing in court. Realized she existed because a 120-pound tobacco farmer had decided to lie in an 18-inch ditch and call artillery down on his own position. She withdrew from the case, filed a formal recommendation that the Army grant Connor's upgrade, added her voice to the growing chorus demanding recognition. The case moved slowly, through bureaucratic channels and review boards and congressional committees. Years passed. Pauline aged, but never stopped fighting. On June 26, 2018, 73 years after Connor had lain in that ditch, President Trump presented the Medal of Honor to Connor's family in a White House ceremony. Pauline was 89 years old. She sat in a wheelchair at the front of the room, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who had never met the quiet farmer but knew his story now. The citation was read aloud, the details of that frozen morning in January 1945. The 400-yard sprint under artillery fire, the 3 hours in the ditch, the order to fire on his own position. The 6 Tigers stopped. The 600 Germans turned back. The battalion saved. Pauline accepted the medal with hands that trembled from age and emotion. She held it the way Connor had held the telephone handset that morning, like it was the most important thing in the world. Later, reporters asked her why she had fought so hard for so long, why it had mattered so much to force the Army to recognize what Connor had done. She looked at the medal in her lap, at the blue ribbon and the gold star. Oh, at the physical representation of 3 hours of hell that her husband had endured, and then hidden in a closet because talking about courage felt like bragging. "He saved all those men," she said. "And then he came home and never said a word. I couldn't let him be forgotten. Someone had to say his name." The medal sits in the Kentucky Military History Museum now, behind glass, next to a photograph of Connor in his uniform and a section of telephone wire from the battlefield. Thousands of people walk past it every year. Most of them have never heard the story. They see the medal and the photograph and move on. But some stop. Some read the plaque that describes what happened on that frozen morning. Some understand what it means when an ordinary man makes an extraordinary decision. When a 120-pound tobacco farmer becomes the eyes of 12 howitzers and the shield of an entire battalion. Connor would have hated the attention, would have insisted he was just doing his job, would have said other men deserved more credit. But Pauline made sure the world knew anyway, made sure that 50 years of silence ended with truth, made sure that the man who had saved hundreds of soldiers and then hidden his medals in a cardboard box would finally, inevitably, be remembered. If you want to see more of stories like this, please hit the like button and subscribe. It helps us share more forgotten stories from World War II, and comment where you're watching from.